where we talk about everything under the sun, diversity, equity, and inclusion related. Um, and this week is no exception. I am joined by Dr. Jeb Hurley. And I have to, Jeb was super kind because we were introduced by somebody that we both know and love. And he sent me all of these emails and connections, and somehow like the ships just kept crossing in the night. And I think, Jeb, it was like a month, and I went, oh crap.
Oh yeah, right.
Right. And then as soon as you and I connected, we started wonking out on neuroscience and behavior change, and how the work that y'all are doing and what we're doing, there's this beautiful overlap. I'm going to let you introduce yourself and your background because I think it's fascinating where you've come from and how you got to where you are now and the cool work that you're doing with Trust Metrics. So tell us all about yourself, Jeb.
My least favorite perhaps topic. It's that's why I said little bios, because it's like, no, you just read it and then we're done with that. Because it's like, okay, where do you come from? I think that so I'll say the important stuff maybe for last. So I'll talk about things like sort of career and education, sort of first, because it's relevant in the sense that my background is business from an operating standpoint. So I'm not an academic, despite the prefix on my name, and that came much later in my career. And I grew up in sales and product management, and then moved into sort of general management and sort of roles running big pieces of big companies, years ago, Eastman Kodak and digital equipment, more recently, Hewlett Packard. I've also done several startups. So I sort of have lived this life between dimensions, really, because they are different worlds.
Different worlds.
But I've loved sort of being able to move between them. And too often folks have sort of a binary with that. Well, big companies are this or startups are that. And, I think reality is, for me, was I found both joy, learning, and satisfaction, found purpose in each of those. But sort of the thread that runs through that.
Joy, learning, and satisfaction. Like, I love that. Okay, keep going.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
I told you I was going to jump in.
Yeah. I suppose but the threads that run through that have been this, from very early on, this deep, abiding curiosity about sort of people, but that sounds so generic, but really about leadership and sort of what made it work. And that sort of defined a big part of my career journey, along with this sort of drive to innovate and sort of and lead change, which often got me in trouble early in my career, because it was always like, no, this doesn't work, let's do this. And right. Of course, in big old corporations, it wasn't, which I think is what drove me to move back and forth. But those threads really defined my journey, and in many respects that sort of led me through these various roles, and also sort of centered them, and ultimately led, interestingly, to in the last 10 years, a real interest in sort of helping develop a new generation of leaders, and becoming very frustrated with the approaches that, and I could kind of go off on this and I won't, but so I'll leave it to say these approaches, which are embodied in sort of it started in the late 19th, early 20th century, but certainly after World War II. And they do actually tie into sort of the diversity, inclusion, and sort of these areas where there was a very top-down, leader-centric, and often sort of the great man theories of leadership that permeated sort of the post-World War II. And to this day, a lot of the methodology, a lot of the approaches and models in leadership development still have these remnants left over, and often they're like unconscious biases.
They're like a vampire. You can't kill them.
Exactly. And there's a whole industry built around sort of, which is really fascinating. It drove me nuts, actually. There's a whole industry kind of built around things that don't really work, but you have to keep doing them. So, it
because they're known right? And they're known and people can get budget for them and they don't
Exactly.
work.
It's like advertising. So some of it works, some doesn't. But if you want to cut, what do you cut? So anyway, that the relevance of that is that led me 5-6 years ago to sort of put me on a path to doing ultimately a deep dive into really wanting to understand what drives exceptional leadership. And so that ultimately resulted in a doctorate in organizational leadership with a focus in the behavioral science side of it. So, or human motivation, team effectiveness, and engagement. And so a few books, a bunch of articles, and such later. Today I'm really focused on building better teams with behavioral science. And what I mean by better is helping particularly young, frontline, emerging young leaders really understand how you can connect the dots between things like trust and performance. Yep. And how bettering other people's lives can make you a far more effective as a leader, but also transformational as an individual. So that's kind of the
and that focus on young frontline leaders and I not necessarily even age young, right? But young leaders.
That's right.
Which Katie Tynan with Forrester, I loved hearing her where she was talking about when you put tools and resources in that group's hands, you are impacting a good 80% of your organization.
Correct. Yes.
So, and so you and I obviously connected on a million fronts, Jeb, because first we were just doing show and tell, like, here's the app and here's trust metrics and oh, that's cool. And oh, why'd you build that check mark in? And that's where we're geeking out on the behavior change side of things. And then I really wanted to dive into this concept in one of your articles, and maybe what we'll do is link that after in the comments around this concept of trust ladders. And it did crack me up at first because, I think back to the ropes course and like jumping off the thing and climbing, doing all these things. Right. That's why I had to make this comment. This is not about ropes courses.
Yes, exactly.
So let's talk about what is a trust ladder and how it really impacts and can create inclusive team environments.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll so to set the stage with that, with one of the real sort of epiphanies or ahas in my research was when I saw the role that trust played in elite teams. I was working with an Israeli Air Force pilot squadron, and which was really cool, and studying other elite teams. But this emerged and didn't emerge not as a character trait. So we all look for trust in our relationships, of course. I mean, that's human. But it was trust as a catalyst. And what I mean by a catalyst is literally the way in which trust triggers the neurobiology, the neurochemistry that shapes behaviors that ultimately lead to change, successful change that sticks. And I observed this again and again in both the language that was being used in elite teams and ultimately the results. So trust ladders are sort of built around the very simple and very simple idea. And the cool thing about behavioral science is that it often reduces things. It's like great sauce or great wine. It reduces them to their essence. Mm-hmm. And trust ladders are built around one very, very simple the core behavioral science idea, concept, which is that trust is a function of our expectations, positive expectations of another human being, another person, and our positive experiences delivered by that person.
Say it again say it again and slowly.
Yeah. So trust at its very essence when it acts as a catalyst is because it's based on our expectations, ideally positive expectations of another person, and an experience that meets that expectation, that is equally positive. So you can think about this in any aspect of our lives. Think about any relationship you've ever had. in terms of where it's great and when it breaks down.
Yep.
So, if we have high expectations of a significant other, a spouse, and what happens when they consistently deliver well below those what happens to the relationship? And
Right.
so you go this cycle of deterioration, and ultimately we disengage.
And so it's the combination of expectation and experience.
Correct. And what's powerful about that, and this is where the sort of the science, the behavioral science of it comes in, is that your expectation of a relationship, mine, 10 other people are all going to be a little different.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and can I interrupt you?
Yeah, sure.
So my husband and I will talk about this where I'm like a golden retriever puppy, right? I come into every to every interaction fully expecting good human beings.
Yes.
Fully. And then you have to kick me in the head a couple of times to disprove that to me, right? My experience has to be,
Yeah.
it has to be, right? So I can be a slow learner with people that have not earned trust.
Yes.
My husband comes in more like the Rottweiler, right?
Uh-huh.
Where he's right, and not the Rottweiler puppy, like the Rottweiler. And
Yes.
I'm talking about, of course, now all of you Rottweiler lovers, they're great dogs. Don't come after me in the comments. I'm just giving that, right? Or the German Shepherd, or the much more, you have to prove it and prove it and prove it, and then I will give you my
Yes.
trust, right?
It-
So that's some of the expectation piece.
That's
That-
exactly right. And that, from a leadership standpoint, from an organization, is really important to understand that what you just described perfectly, because the where someone starts their baseline with expectation, and in your husband's case, it's a matter of, his neurochemistry gets triggered by people meeting or exceeding that expectation, and it moves up. And
Right.
so over time, trust gets built. So we build trust ladder. In his case, we're building a trust ladder that over time, each rung of it is being driven by my demonstrating trustworthy behavior and doing what I say I'm going to do, whatever the context, and I build a trust ladder. In your case, that you come in with an assumption, with high expectations, and so building trust ladders with you is a matter of maintaining them, because in some respects there's only one way to go, which is down the ladder. Both, and there's never a good nor bad with what it is. It's what's important from a leadership standpoint is to recognize that one of the most powerful things you can do as a leader is to understand how to build and sustain trust in your organization. You do that with trust ladders.
Mhm.
So if I know on a team of 10 people where each person where do they start? Where's their baseline? And then do the things that build or sustain a trust ladder, then I've laid the groundwork for peak performance. Because now I have a group of people who will, are more flexible, that will change easier, they're comfortable, they're psychologically safe. They're more than willing to, if there's an issue, because we're human, it's not, these elite teams, all of they're human, they have issues. But what they're really good at is closing the trust gaps that sustain the trust ladders.
Yep. Yep.
And that's the key. It's not being perfect people. That isn't going to happen. It is about getting really good at closing the gaps that ensure that we don't suddenly, that our trust ladders don't collapse.
Yep.
And suddenly we're in a situation where we've deteriorated or ultimately disengaged from relationships, at work, on our teams, in a company environment. So that's why that notion of a simple little, metaphor, a trust ladder, if you think about it's every day, it's what you do to ensure that you build them and keep them steady.
Right. And that and again, expectations and experiences, and this is one of the conversations that you and I were having about behavior change and about sustained behavior change, and about, like, you can't set it and forget it.
That's right.
Right. So it is this ongoing monitoring, actions, feedback loops, right? To make sure that I can see where you are and how we can right? How we can be up and down those trust ladders and paying attention to that.
Yeah, it's kind of human to human science. It's there's a whole bunch of science behind it, which is really cool because it's powerful, it works. But at a just human level, the more that you put trust at the center, and trust as the catalyst, trust as a character trait, we all want it. Trust as the catalyst, as recognizing that it's the key to inclusive behaviors. It's the key to um, to detoxifying relationships or teams or organizations. And it's because it's an antidote. It's the antidote to it. The more I focus on building trust ladders and trust, the less I'm affected by some of the other things that get in the way of peak performance as an organization or as a human being.
Right. The mistakes that are made, the things that are inevitably going to come up. How do we shorten that? So what are some things that can be done then, right, to shorten the gaps?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, closing gaps starts with the creating an environment, a psychologically safe environment that people feel comfortable in putting voice out there. Because without that, you're kind of dead in the water. It all starts with
100% dead in the water. Full stop.
Exactly. So it's right. So it starts with the first thing is the feedback that identifies gaps. So it's that simple. It's if I create a conversation where I've identified where and I've run this in sort of lots of instances, but sort of one quick story. I was working with an organization, a manufacturing company back east in New York, and they had a turnover problem in their R&D, one of their R&D organizations. And it was mostly, the first thing, first flag that goes up, it's mostly younger women and actually Asian women. Mm-hmm. And so we quickly identified there was an unconscious gender bias issue but it was playing out in not a aggressive sort of, it was playing out in a people being talked over, people's ideas not being recognized, but 15 minutes later, a guy around the table would raise the same thing and be lauded for it. And it's like, okay.
So we talk about that in our work, right? So those are microaggressions. We talk about those as the subtle headwinds.
Exactly.
Where oftentimes we think that this is going to be the big thing that happened.
Nope.
Right. The Mad Men workplaces are mostly gone. It's the subtleties.
That's exactly
the microaggressions and the death by a million paper cuts.
Exactly. And what was kind of cool is that when we put that on the table and the head, the VP actually, who usually didn't get very involved in, sort of didn't step between the directors and got involved, but was very smart in that she put it to the team to say, okay, we've identified this. What are you going to do about it? Instead of mandating, saying this is against policy, and two things happened. One, the men on the team were actually pretty, she related to me later, I wasn't there, but pretty appalled at themselves, which is a good sign. That they didn't actually recognize the behavior, which i.e. unconscious. But second, they themselves, they took ownership as a team, and they created a little behavioral nudge. Which is so cool. They called it a timeout. So they must all have had a lot of young kids, a lot of
right.
They called it a timeout. And the way it worked was, and this was still all remote, this was all on Zoom calls, that when anybody exhibited that behavior, and others could see it, of course, they just raised their hand. So they called out their peer without calling them out in a way that was sort of would put somebody on the defensive. But what it does do, to geek out just for a second, two things happen there. That act of raising your hand triggers just a little squirt of dopamine because I took control. For the person that did it, you just triggered a cortisol release. It's stress. Suddenly there was this stress.
Which I want to avoid, right? I want to avoid cortisol.
Within a few weeks, the behavior changed. Because no one wanted to be no one wanted to be the one on the Zoom call that wasn't raising their hand. And of course, so that it was a great example of, building trust through a small behavioral nudge that had a very big impact on the quality of the people's lives on that team.
Yep.
And so that's, kind of going back to trust ladders and sort of getting at how you build those. It's all about it's not action item lists. It's not mandates or posters. It's those little acts that have a big impact on people's behavior, and the reinforcing actions like timeouts that help ensure that they become a habit.
And the simple, small, powerful, right? Simple, small, powerful, ongoing versus, right? Okay, we're going to have this mandate, we're going to have this thing, and then we're going to do this long-term training, and it's this.
Exactly. And that's very human. And it's not to say that, of course, organizations, need to have, there's a reason why you need to have policies, you need to have clarity, all of that. But that doesn't make it happen, and that's the policy isn't behavior, isn't habit, is no more than, somebody can put a sign up and say, go to the gym, and okay, that's not going to motive, that doesn't trigger the brain chemistry that gets me up and, on a cold morning or evening and going to the gym and you have to. And I think in a team-based world where we've moved away from these 20th century, command and control hierarchies to teams of teams, understanding how to foster trust and the behaviors that support it, to build the trust ladders that ultimately take teams and organizations to peak performance, is so much more important than kind of the traits and types based sort of leadership. None of that takes you to a point where people are changing their behaviors.
Well, and I think there's another thing that I want to unpeel here, and that is this focus really on small nuclear teams versus the entire organization.
Yes.
So let's talk about those small nuclear teams and trust ladders on those small teams, and then how do you build trust ladders between teams?
Yeah, well, the cool thing is that the same, there's a great saying that I'm borrowing from someone, and I can't remember it. I can't who to give the credit to, but it'll come to me. But that personality and sort of and traits don't scale. Process but neurobiology does. Mm-hmm. So and that's really important to recognize, because the key within a team, the measuring of trust gaps, of creating that virtuous cycle of feedback, measurement, the identifying the nudge, and then tracking it. So that cycle works. It's completely scalable, because you're tapping into something very fundamental at a human level, which is we all want to go. Maybe not all, that's overstating it. Most people want to go to work feeling good about what they're doing, who they're working with, and the contribution they make. So when they go home at night, they feel fulfilled. Yeah. That doesn't happen when I don't trust the people I work with.
Right.
I spend far more energy on maneuvering and the politics and the gossip, and it's exhausting. So whether it's on a team or as you look at a network of teams, when you set up that same dynamic, we're going to get feedback on how we're doing supporting your team and vice versa. We're going to identify gaps that are getting in the way of us bringing, being fully engaged and accomplishing the goals that we set out. Take actions to close it, little nudges, behavioral nudges, and then track that progress. You team by team, you build a foundation in an organization. And the coolest thing is, and the reason I like to start with front lines, is not only do they represent 80% of people, report into a frontline manager, but because it's far more difficult to actually get, sort of mid-level and more senior managers to change.
Yeah.
Unless so when you do it from kind of top down, and it's not that it can't be done. And I've had the good fortune of having been invested in at Center for Creative Leadership at Harvard Business School, at the Aspen Institute. So I know, these leadership programs work. They really do. They can change you. But if you want to change an organization, and it's a team-based organization, you do it from the foundations up. Yeah. Because in doing that, by giving a leader data that shows how relationships are going on teams, you change the way they lead. And the net result is
right. Anything that you're paying attention to.
Exactly.
Right. And if I can measure it, right, and then see progress, all of the geek out for a second on some of the biology. We talked a little bit about dopamine, cortisol, right? That we're actually hardwired for this stuff.
Yes, we are. We're hardwired in two ways. I think that, and this is important to kind of bring it sort of back to the neurobiology, but with diversity and inclusion, that often, the unconscious bias has a negative, at least my sense is, you're the expert, but my sense is most people it has this bit of a negative societal connotation to it. And what people forget, because they hear it in the context of, well, you have an unconscious bias that's leading to someone being affected in a negative way in an organization or in a setting. But the reality, of course, is that unconscious bias started with fight or flight. And so if you're out tending a field and a saber-toothed lion is coming, having an unconscious bias that this is not going to go well if I don't run, that's where it starts as humans. And that of course moves us towards comfort with people that are like us, people that think like us, because 10,000 years ago, if I didn't do that, I probably died.
Yep.
And so those are really, so it's important to recognize those are really strong. When they have negative consequences, of course, is what we discussed, which is when it triggers, it's someone's running, so it may be night, someone's jogging, and I have a adrenaline and cortisol response because I'm afraid it's a mugger kind of thing, because somebody has their hood up. So now, those responses begin to move into a space that it becomes dysfunctional.
Yep.
And that's, of course, where we get, gender bias and race bias and a lot of these unconscious biases that get triggered by things that started out as they're very human. But the challenge becomes, how do I replace from a neurobiological and neurochemical standpoint, how do we replace the ones that trigger this response with a more inclusive response? And,
right.
and that's where that starts with oxytocin, actually. So that's the and I don't want to overstate it, and I'm not a neuroscientist, but I defer to people like Dr. Paul Zak at the Claremont Graduate Institute has done a lot of work in this space. And Paul's work has shown that this relationship between trustworthiness and trust and oxytocin, it sets the stage. It doesn't, these aren't magic bullets, but it sets the stage for being more empathetic, for being more aware of differences in a positive way.
Yeah.
And that's the key, is that, we're not going to you're not going to fix it overnight, but if I'm more empathetic to someone's difference, for whatever reason, gender, race, disability, whatever it may be, I am far more likely, if I make that a habit of triggering a positive neuro reward chemical rather than a negative response, I'm far more likely to act out in a positive way towards that individual. And that's the key.
Yeah, this is where I'm about to dive deep down a rabbit hole with you, and we don't have time. We just covered a lot of ground. What is one last truth bomb you want to leave us with around trust ladders? And what's one truth bomb, and what's one action that each person can take to start closing the gaps?
Yeah, I think that, and maybe they're one and the same, because I think that people, individuals, and whether you're in a leadership role somewhere, that with a lot of responsibility, or an individual contributor, if you if you lead with trust, if you put that at the center, and again, as the catalyst which sort of guides and reinforces what you do, you've laid the foundation to do great things. You really have. And I think that's, and so we as humans, we tend to make things quite complex. We have an amazing ability to undermine what's good for us, what's in our own interest. And there's a lot, there's self-reflection, there's a lot of things around that. But really, because trust is so core to who we are as humans, and the survival of, we're only here today because historically people trusted one another enough to have families to live in. I mean, but we tend to take it for granted until it goes wrong. And so I think that truth bomb, that is, don't take it for granted. Lead with it. And which means that you make it, you put it in the center, or from a conscious leadership standpoint, you're always thinking about how it is I'm building those trust ladders. What effect am I having on other people relative to how they trust me or not? And you become comfortable. It takes a little bit of courage, because the T word falls along, with all those other capital letter words that, I can say, as a quick aside, I can say, Mo, I've got some feedback that you communicate this a little better. And most of the time, say, Jeff, thank you very much. If I come to you and say, Mo, I've got some feedback, people don't trust you. You get an immediate, most people immediately feel it in their stomach.
Yep.
I just trigger, and this is neurochemistry at work, because of that, we tend to have a strong unconscious bias that people trust us far more than they do. And rather than assume it, if you put it at the center, you earn it. And that's the key.
And centering on it. Yeah, centering on that. Great. I knew this time was going to go fast. It did. Thank you. We'll put a link out to both Trust Metrics, because you got to check out the tool that they put together, y'all. It's so cool. And then this article on Trust Ladders. So thank you for all the work that you do in the world. Really, really appreciate it. And yeah, everybody get out there, do the next right thing, center on trust, and think about those gaps, right? Be really, really intentional. It's through all of this, all of us doing things like this, that we create this more inclusive world. So,
Indeed. Mo, thank you so much. Likewise, what you and Moxie Exchange, what you guys are doing is just awesome, really.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure.
See you next week, everybody. Cheers.